Hey guys, tonight we are wandering into a place you've probably pictured only in old storybooks, the endless trail of camel caravans along the silk routes. You step out at dawn, the dust already curling up from the ground, the smell of leather harnesses, sweat, and boiled tea mingling in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a donkey brays like it's auditioning for a medieval alarm clock, and you realize, yes, this is your ride for the day. Or rather, your ride is a camel, and you should probably lower your expectations. You might think you could handle this romantic life of the road, but let's be honest. You probably won't survive the first week without developing a deep hatred for sand, in places sand has no right to be. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, leave a comment telling me your location and what time it is where you're listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake in a caravanserai, one of those fortress-like inns built to corral merchants, animals, and the occasional overly dramatic storyteller. The air is cool, just for a brief moment, before the sun climbs high enough to remind you why everyone keeps talking about heat. You hear the shuffle of sandals, the grunt of camels being nudged awake, and the creak of ropes tightening around bundles of precious cargo. This is the dawn departure. No snooze button, no cappuccino machine. Just a rough slap on the back and the knowledge that the day ahead is hundreds of miles long. As you look around, you notice how strangely cheerful people seem, despite the early hour. The merchants hum to themselves, tying sacks of peppercorns and bolts of silk, while younger boys scramble up the camels to balance the loads. One fellow, clearly still half asleep, almost ties his turban around a camel's neck by mistake. Nobody bothers correcting him until the camel gives a low groan, like an irritated uncle being woken from a nap. The facts of this trade are simple. The Silk Road connected China with the Mediterranean, carrying goods and ideas for centuries. What textbooks rarely say is how gritty and repetitive the routine was. Every day looked something like this. Load the animals, shuffle into the desert, eat whatever salty or dried food hadn't gone off yet, and pray that the next oasis still had water. Historians still argue whether the majority of these caravans were large, 100-camel convoys, or smaller, tight-knit groups. The truth is, it depended on the danger level and the wealth of the traders involved. You notice the caravan leader, usually the most experienced merchant, walking around with a stick, tapping ropes, double-checking knots, and scolding anyone who tried to slip an extra cushion into their load. Space is money, and there's no room for frivolous comfort. One man, however, insists on bringing his personal loot, wrapped carefully in cloth. Everyone sighs, knowing they'll be forced to listen to his practice sessions later under the stars. Your senses are already filling with dust, even before the caravan sets off. The courtyard feels alive with movement. Snorts, clinking bells tied to camels, men shouting half-commands in several languages. Persian, Sogdian, Arabic, and sometimes even scraps of Latin drift through the air. For a moment you realize, this is more than trade. It's the earliest form of international airport chaos, minus the overpriced sandwiches. A fringe detail drifts into your ears as one trader tells a story about his grandmother's peculiar sunscreen. Crocodile dung mixed with oil, slathered thick to keep the rays off. You can't tell if he's serious or simply trying to gross out the younger boys. Either way, everyone laughs, except the poor lad who now has to imagine that smell on top of desert sweat. Camels groan and shuffle, like reluctant employees on a Monday morning, but once nudged forward, they slip into that hypnotic, plodding gait. You can feel the anticipation. No one knows what the day will bring. Maybe a sandstorm, maybe a lucky sale in the next town, maybe just another long, dusty march. Some merchants sip from tiny clay cups of tea, the bitterness waking their tongues. Others chew dried fruit slowly, knowing it has to last until noon. You stand there, blinking at the rising sun, realizing that this journey doesn't begin with adventure, but with patience. The Silk Road was less about exotic treasures and more about enduring the same routine so many times that your brain eventually starts narrating the stones under your sandals. A historian might tell you that these morning rituals formed the backbone of global exchange. Without countless weary dawns like this one, there would have been no porcelain in Paris, no glass beads in Beijing, no unexpected culinary experiments in kitchens across continents. Yet the little human quirks, someone slipping on a stone, a camel stubbornly refusing to budge, the ongoing argument about whether dried apricots are better than dates, made it all feel less like a grand saga and more like a road trip that simply refused to end. You pull your cloak tighter, inhaling the earthy smell of wool and dust. Around you, the line begins to form. Camels sway, ropes creak, bells chime. Someone sneezes dramatically into the morning air, and the caravan erupts in chuckles. The sun pushes higher, promising heat, thirst, and endless sand. But for now, there's a hush, the peculiar hush of a journey just about to unfold. You find yourself drawn toward the bustle of packing, where the day's true work lies. Each bale, each jar, each tiny satchel is a story wrapped in cloth or leather. The merchants handle their goods with the kind of reverence you usually reserve for fragile phone screens. One slip, and someone's fortune shatters into sand. You watch as long rolls of silk, dyed in shades of crimson and indigo, are folded carefully, their shimmer catching the dawn light. Even after weeks of being jostled around on camelback, the fabric still whispers luxury. A small group handles jars of glass, packed in straw and cushioned with wool. They look oddly modern, almost like something you'd see in a minimalist kitchen store, except these are filled with things far stranger than olive oil. There are powders, dried herbs, and a few suspiciously mysterious liquids. One man insists his jar contains a cure for hiccups, though no one has the courage to test it. You imagine yourself hiccuping through half the desert, with everyone glaring at you like you'd summoned an ancient curse. The camels themselves loom nearby, groaning with disapproval at every new bundle. You can practically hear them saying, "Really? Another box of cinnamon? Wasn't the last 20 enough?" Their handlers move with practiced rhythm, swinging ropes, tying knots, and balancing loads so that no animal tips over. The science of weight distribution is surprisingly exact. Too heavy on one side, and the camel may refuse to move. Or worse, it may sit down and refuse to get up, the four-legged equivalent of a toddler's tantrum in the grocery aisle. You glance at one bale of cloth, dyed a shade so bright it looks radioactive against the sand. The merchant beams proudly, declaring it a revolutionary color that will surely fetch 10 times the usual price. Historians still argue whether ancient dyes were really that vibrant, or if merchants exaggerated their brilliance to impress foreign buyers. Either way, you're not sure if the buyers in Rome will love it or use it to scare off crows. Alongside silk and dyes, there are bundles of spices. Peppercorns clink like tiny stones in their sacks, while cinnamon curls stick out like delicate barky tongues. A merchant gently lifts one bundle toward you, letting the aroma drift under your nose. The scent is sharp, sweet, and dizzying, and you wonder how people back in medieval Europe, used to boiled cabbage and bread, must have reacted to such intensity. Probably with tears of joy, or maybe actual tears, since someone definitely overpeppered the stew. And then there are the luxury oddities. One man carries a small cage with a peacock feather fan, clearly for display, because who in their right mind would fan themselves with actual peacock feathers on a journey through the desert? Another fellow insists on bringing lacquered boxes that rattle suspiciously when moved, though he assures everyone they contain fine trinkets. Everyone knows that means gambling dice, but they politely pretend not to notice. Amid the serious goods, a boy sneaks in something less valuable but more personal, a bundle of dried flowers from his village. He hides them under a sack of salt, hoping no one notices. When the caravan leader eventually discovers them, he sighs, shrugs, and lets it pass. Even on the Silk Road, sentimentality finds its way into the load. The entire process feels like watching a slow-motion orchestra, ropes creaking instead of violins, camel grunts instead of percussion. It's a ritual that has played out for centuries, repeated in caravanserais from China to Anatolia. Without it, nothing moves. No trade flows. No legends about faraway lands reach the ears of dreamers. The goods may seem like the stars of the show, but really it's the quiet efficiency of this packing ritual that makes the Silk Road run. You catch an odd tidbit from an older man who swears that once a fellow merchant packed an entire wooden chair for the journey because his back was delicate. The chair never survived the first week, splintering after being dropped by a disgruntled camel. The morale, of course, is that comfort is an illusion and sand eventually wins. As the final bundles are tied, you notice the rhythm of the caravan settling in. The leader checks each knot, tugging at ropes like a parent making sure shoes are tied before sending kids off to school. Camels sway slightly, bells chiming softly, their long lashes blinking against the rising sun. Dust already begins to curl around hooves and sandals, the taste of the road seeping into your mouth before you even leave the gate. There's no grandeur here, no cinematic swelling music. Just the quiet clatter of jars, the faint perfume of cinnamon, and the grumbling chorus of camels carrying half the world's curiosities on their backs. And you, blinking into the brightness, wondering if you'll ever see silk the same way again once you've smelled the sweat and dust that carried it halfway across the earth. The caravan gate opens with a heavy groan, and you step into the pale morning light. The first crunch of gravel beneath sandals feels strangely ceremonial, as if every merchant and camel is aware that this one small sound will be repeated thousands of times before the journey is done. You glance back at the caravanserai, its walls now shrinking behind you, already filling with the stories of tomorrow's travelers. Out here, the road stretches forward like an endless ribbon of beige, shimmering slightly as if daring you to keep walking. The camels fall into line almost instinctively, long necks bobbing in a slow wave. Their padded feet sink softly into the gravel and sand, producing a muffled rhythm that soon becomes the background hum of your day. Bells tied to their harnesses tinkle unevenly, a lazy percussion that would drive a musician mad, but somehow comforts you. You're not striding boldly into adventure. You're plodding, squinting, and already wondering why no one thought to invent sunglasses. The air smells of dust, leather, and faint spice as sacks jostle with each step. Somewhere near the front, a man begins humming a tune in Sogdian, the melody drifting back through the line. It's not exactly catchy, but it does keep you from focusing too hard on the pebble that has already found its way into your sandal. You stop to shake it out, but of course, another one sneaks in immediately. Welcome to the glamorous life of Silk Road travel. Mainstream historians like to point out that the Silk Road wasn't really one road, but a whole network of routes spreading like tangled yarn across Eurasia. Yet to your tired eyes, it feels very much like a single path, long, straight, and unforgiving. The caravan leader occasionally pauses to look at landmarks, a lopsided rock formation, a stunted tree, or the distant glimmer of an oasis. No GPS here, just memory, the stars at night, and the kind of stubborn instinct that only develops after decades of walking the same terrain. A quirky tidbit reaches you from a pair of merchants chatting nearby. Apparently, one caravan years ago tried to train ostriches as pack animals. The experiment failed spectacularly, with the birds outrunning the camels, scattering loads everywhere, and terrifying children in villages along the way. You can almost picture the chaos. Giant birds sprinting wildly while jars of pepper smash into the dirt. The men chuckle, and you can't help laughing softly too, thankful that your current caravan sticks to the more predictable, if grumpy, camels. The landscape shifts as the morning unfolds. Gravel gives way to rolling dunes, soft underfoot, forcing everyone into shorter steps. You hear sandals scraping, people sighing, and one camel groaning like it has just read its to-do list for the day. The sun climbs higher, brushing heat across your shoulders, but for now, there's still a cool breath of morning air hanging on. You savor it, knowing it won't last. Historians still argue whether most caravans traveled strictly by day or shifted to night marches under moonlight to escape the sun. Some say merchants preferred daytime for safety and navigation, while others argue that night travel was common in the hotter stretches. Judging by the glare that's already making you squint, you secretly vote for night. But no one's asking, and the camels seem determined to keep plodding forward regardless. Every so often, you glance at the goods strapped beside you. A sack of pepper bumps rhythmically against your leg. Another load of indigo cloth sways dramatically, as if showing off to the desert. You realize these aren't just trade items. They're living reminders of distant lands, each step carrying them closer to markets that have never smelled pepper, this strong, or seen cloth this blue. You're part of a chain that spans continents, though at the moment it mostly feels like you're part of a sweaty, dusty parade. You notice how silence creeps in, broken only by the occasional muttered complaint. It's the silence of people settling into rhythm, realizing that conversation takes energy they'd rather save for later. The bells, the crunch, the soft hiss of wind, these become the soundtrack of your march. Oddly enough, it soothes you. You start to match your breathing to the camel's sway, your feet falling in time with their hooves. For a brief moment, you almost believe you could keep walking forever. And then, of course, your sandal strap snaps. You stumble, laugh quietly at your luck, and tie it back together with a scrap of cloth. The merchant behind you gives you a look that says, "Rookie mistake," but then kindly hands you a bit of spare twine. This is the truth of the Silk Road. Not just spices and silk, but shared twine, shared water, and shared laughter at each other's clumsy moments. The horizon remains flat, stubborn, and distant, yet you keep moving. With each step, the caravan stretches into a long ribbon across the sand. You taste the dust on your tongue, feel the sting of grit in your eyes, and wonder how many travelers before you thought the exact same thing. The road is endless, but at least you're not walking it alone. By the time the sun climbs high enough to glare down like a suspicious landlord, you're already thinking about shade. The morning coolness has vanished, and the air presses against you, heavy and unrelenting. You glance at the camels, their mouths opening and closing with slow disdain, as though they've been through this routine so many times they don't even bother to complain anymore. You, on the other hand, are sweating through your clothes and wondering if dessert deodorant was ever a thing. Spoiler, it wasn't. The caravan leader raises his staff, signaling a halt. You shuffle gratefully toward a patch of canvas that's being propped up with poles. This is the midday ritual. Stop, shade, and sip. It's not luxury, it's survival. A handful of carpets are spread on the ground, though they're rough and itchy, not the luxurious Persian kind you see in storybooks. Still, you lower yourself down with a sigh, grateful to be out of direct sunlight. A water skin passes around, its contents warm, metallic, and faintly salty. You drink anyway, because in this environment, you don't quibble about flavor. Historians still argue whether these midday halts were carefully timed or simply taken whenever the heat became unbearable. Judging by the sweat dripping down your nose, you're leaning toward the latter. You watch as merchants dig into their personal stash of tricks for cooling off. One man waves a large palm leaf in front of his face, muttering about desert breezes. Another pours a little water onto a scarf and drapes it over his head, sighing theatrically like he's just invented air conditioning. The most committed of the bunch produces a small, polished bronze mirror and angles it to reflect sunlight away from himself, inadvertently blinding 3 camels in the process. Amid the routine, a quirky tidbit surfaces. A younger boy tells you how, back in his village, people swore by sprinkling vinegar on their clothes to ward off heat. The older merchants groan at the memory, recalling one unfortunate caravan that smelled like a traveling pickle jar for weeks. You smile, imagining a line of vinegar-scented camels trudging through the desert, accidentally inventing artisanal brine along the way. The air under the canvas fills with murmurs. Merchants exchange quiet words about prices, routes, and rumors of bandits. Someone insists that a nearby oasis town has doubled its tariffs, while another insists the news is exaggerated. You realize that this midday break isn't just about resting bodies, it's about gathering whispers. Information here travels faster than the camels, passed in half sentences and side glances. As you recline, you notice one camel chewing methodically, unfazed by the heat, its eyes half-lidded in perfect boredom. You envy it. The animals seem almost designed for this. Wide padded feet, long lashes against the sun, and the ability to keep going when every human is on the verge of collapse. One merchant chuckles, saying the camels look smug because they know they're indispensable. You can't argue with that. You peel a fig from a small pouch, its skin sticky and sweet, and bite into it. The sugar surges in your mouth, and for a moment, you forget the heat. Another man gnaws on dried goat jerky, his jaw working so hard it looks like he's rehearsing for a role as a stone crusher. Food here is more about practicality than pleasure, though sometimes you get lucky with a treat. A handful of almonds, a scrap of honeycomb, a fig, tiny bursts of happiness in an otherwise dusty menu. The wind picks up, flicking grains of sand under the canvas. They sting your skin, but compared to the scorching sun, it's almost refreshing. You lie back, using your bundled cloak as a pillow, staring at the faint shadow lines rippling across the tent fabric. The conversations blur into a gentle murmur, like the low hum of a city street heard from far away. Historians still argue whether midday halts were longer pauses, an hour or two of genuine rest, or just quick stops before pushing forward again. Either way, you're secretly hoping this one drags on forever. You know it won't. The caravan leader is already pacing outside, checking the sky, tapping his staff impatiently against the ground. He's the embodiment of, "We've still got miles to go." And so, after just enough time to feel the sweat dry on your skin, the call to rise echoes again. People groan, brush sand from their clothes, and tug scarves over their heads. The camels are prodded back to their feet, groaning as though to remind everyone that misery loves company. You hoist yourself up, legs stiff, mouth dry, but strangely refreshed by the ritual. As you step back into the blazing sun, you realize this rhythm, march, pause, shade, sip, has guided travelers for centuries. It's not heroic, it's not glamorous, but it's the quiet backbone of survival. You fall back into step, the crunch of gravel returning, the bells tinkling again, and the desert reminding you that comfort is always temporary, but the march is eternal. You fall back into the line, the heat pressing against you like a heavy blanket nobody asked for. The rhythm of the caravan resumes, but this time your ears tune in, less to the crunch of gravel and more to the chatter drifting around you. Midday, it seems, is when tongues loosen, when boredom and fatigue coax out stories, jokes, and the occasional questionable business idea. The two merchants directly behind you are in the middle of an argument about dates. No, not the kind you go on with candles and awkward pauses, but the dried fruit. One swears that the plumper, sticky kind fetch higher prices in Samarkand, while the other insists that the wrinkled, less attractive ones are favored in Baghdad. You quietly wonder if anyone has ever tried speed dating with actual dates, but you wisely keep that thought to yourself. A group of younger traders ahead swap tales about past journeys. One man claims he once met a Greek merchant who could recite Homer's Odyssey backwards after a few cups of wine. Another scoffs, saying that the only Greek he's ever met recited shopping lists backwards when he was drunk, which is significantly less impressive. The laughter rolls down the caravan line, carried like smoke in the wind. Caravan gossip has its own peculiar charm. Someone always claims to know the best shortcut, though historians still argue whether most of those shortcuts actually existed or were just elaborate ways to get new travelers lost. Another insists he heard of a magical well in the desert that refills itself every dawn. Skeptics chuckle, pointing out that if such a well existed, the camels would have bought it already. A quirky tidbit bubbles up from a gray-bearded merchant with a twinkle in his eye. He whispers that long ago, a caravan tried to smuggle a circus across the desert. Performers, monkeys, even an elephant. The elephant, apparently, lasted exactly 2 days before deciding it preferred mud baths to sand baths. No one knows if the story is true, but everyone enjoys the image of an elephant sulking like a stubborn camel on a bad day. You notice the pattern of these conversations. Equal parts rumor, complaint, and absurd exaggeration. It's less about truth and more about entertainment. After all, when your daily scenery is endless sand, your imagination becomes your personal cinema. And like any cinema, the occasional tall tale is worth the price of admission. One group closer to the front debates loudly about tariffs at a city gate. They'll ask for 2 coins per camel, one insists. No, it's 3, argues another. A third man cuts in. It doesn't matter because my cousin knows the guard and he'll wave us through. You get the sense that this cousin exists only in his imagination. Sometimes the gossip turns personal. A boy is teased for writing long letters to someone back home, though no one can figure out how he plans to deliver them in the middle of the desert. Another man proudly announces that his wife once baked bread so fluffy it floated in soup like a cloud. The others groan, accusing him of exaggerating his domestic bliss. You find yourself laughing quietly at a joke about camel flatulence. It's juvenile, yes, but somehow funnier when the entire desert seems to echo the sound like a drum roll. Humor here doesn't need refinement. It needs endurance. You laugh not because the jokes are brilliant, but because they keep the dust from settling too deeply into your mood. Historians still argue whether these conversations carried valuable trade information or were mostly idle chatter. Some records suggest merchants exchanged serious intelligence about shifting borders, while others imply the gossip was little more than speculation wrapped in spice-scented hot air. From your perspective, it feels like both. Practical warnings laced with tall tales, survival wrapped in storytelling. As the caravan stretches onward, the chatter becomes a background murmur, like the desert's own white noise. You let it wash over you, the jokes and boasts and half-truths blending into something oddly comforting. You realize that this gossip isn't just about passing the time, it's about holding the group together. The laughter is a thread, weaving strangers into a temporary family, bound by dust and the absurdity of hauling cinnamon halfway across the earth. You adjust your scarf, glance at the horizon, and smirk at the thought. On the Silk Road, even boredom has a sense of humor. The afternoon heat wears on, and the murmurs of gossip give way to the rustling of satchels. Stomachs grumble almost in unison, like a badly tuned choir, and before long, people start pulling out food. This is the quiet pleasure of the road. Snacks that may be strange, questionable, or surprisingly delightful. You glance around and realize this isn't a feast, but it is a chance to nibble your way through cultures. You start with the most ordinary sight, a cluster of dried apricots, orange like tiny desert suns, sticky enough to glue your fingers together. A young trader pops one into his mouth and sighs so dramatically you'd think he just rediscovered joy itself. You follow suit, and though the apricot tastes more like sweet dust than candy, it still brightens your mood. Nearby, another merchant pulls out hard, salted cheese that looks like it could double as a weapon. He cracks off a chunk and offers it around. You chew carefully, wary of breaking a tooth, but eventually the salty tang melts into something comforting. It's the kind of food that makes you thirsty, which is probably why he follows it with a sip of diluted goat's milk. The taste? Let's just say it's less refreshing beverage and more culinary dare. Then comes the fermented milk drink. Someone passes you a skin bag. It smells sharp enough to make your eyes water. You hesitate, but the encouraging nods around you convince you to take a cautious sip. The liquid is sour, fizzy, and alarmingly alive on your tongue. You gag, then cough, then force a smile, while the others chuckle knowingly. It's an acquired taste, one you're not sure you'll live long enough to acquire. A quirky tidbit emerges as the merchants swap recipes. One insists that in the far steppes, riders ferment milk by strapping bags of it to their horses, letting the constant jostling create the perfect consistency. You picture your camel sloshing around with a bag of milk tied to its side, grinning smugly as it produces artisanal yogurt on the go. Honestly, it feels like the Silk Road's first food truck. Historians still argue whether these snacks were just road rations or carefully chosen items designed to showcase regional specialties during trade. Some records hint that dried fruits and nuts doubled as small gifts, tokens of goodwill when meeting strangers. Others suggest they were simply the most practical foods for survival, lightweight, long-lasting, and resistant to dessert tantrums. As you chew, the variety around you becomes clear. A man from Persia munches pistachios, cracking shells with the skill of someone who's been doing it since childhood. A Chinese trader pulls out a packet of candied ginger, its sweet fire cutting through the monotony of dried cheese and flatbread. Another man, clearly more adventurous, offers roasted locusts on a skewer. You politely decline, though you notice a few brave souls crunching happily, claiming they taste like almonds. The snacks become conversation pieces. People trade bites, compare flavors, and argue about whose homeland produces the best raisins. It's a moment of cultural exchange long before the goods reach bustling city markets. Here on the road, the sharing of food is as much about trust as it is about taste. You nibble on flatbread that crumbles like parchment in your hands. It's bland, but when paired with honey from a small clay jar, it suddenly feels like dessert. The honey sparkles amber in the sunlight, thick and fragrant, a reminder that sweetness can travel just as far as silk. One boy pulls out a bundle of almonds roasted with sesame seeds. He passes them shyly, and soon everyone is crunching contentedly, lips glistening with oil. The sound is strangely musical, a crisp rhythm against the dull thud of hooves. The camels eye your snacks with quiet resentment, chewing their cud as though to say, "We invented this whole chewing thing, and you're still amateurs." One particularly bold camel stretches its long neck toward a merchant's figs, only to be swatted away with a cloth. The camel sighs and resumes chewing grass that looks like it came from a lawn nobody watered in months. You lean back against your pack, crumbs sticking to your clothes, and realize these modest snacks are more than sustenance. They are little bursts of civilization carried into the wilderness, flavors from faraway orchards and kitchens that remind each traveler of home. You chew, sip, and swallow, knowing that without these small comforts, the desert would feel endless. With them, it feels just tolerable enough to keep walking. The sun sinks lower, softening into that peculiar desert gold that makes even the dust look romantic. As the horizon swallows the heat, the caravan prepares to stop. You shuffle forward, stretching your legs that now creak like the hinges of an old chest. The camels grunt as if to say, "Finally," and the lead driver raises his arm, pointing toward a cluster of low tents already flapping gently in the evening wind. This is the caravanserai, the pit stop of antiquity, equal parts motel, truck stop, and gossip hub. You enter through a heavy gate that looks as though it has seen centuries of weary travelers. Inside, the courtyard bustles with life. Camels kneeling to be unloaded, donkeys braying in protest, and merchants sighing as they peel dust-soaked layers from their shoulders. The air smells like sweat, leather, and spice stew drifting from a central hearth. You realize this is as close to luxury as the silk routes get. 4 walls, a roof, and the chance not to sleep on rocks. Caravanserais were positioned like pearls along the trade roads, each roughly a day's journey apart. Mainstream history tells us they provided security and shelter, funded by rulers who understood that safer merchants meant more taxes collected. But there's a quirky twist. Some of these outposts doubled as early postal hubs, with couriers galloping between them, carrying letters. You imagine a tired rider showing up, delivering not love notes, but shopping lists. Please send more dried apricots. Also, your mother misses you. Historians still argue whether caravanserais were primarily state-run institutions or profit-making ventures run by local elites. The debate lingers, but one thing is clear. They were oases of human activity, small islands of comfort in a sea of emptiness. Inside, the rooms are simple stone cells, barely large enough for you to roll out a mat and sigh dramatically at the luxury of a door. The walls echo with snores, coughs, and the occasional lullaby hummed by a homesick trader. Privacy, a concept as mythical as winged horses. You sleep in layers of sound, but at least you aren't sleeping with scorpions. The courtyard offers its own rhythm. A cook ladles out a stew of lentils, onions, and whatever protein dared to wander too close. You sip slowly, grateful for the warmth, even though the taste reminds you faintly of damp socks. A man beside you insists that back in Samarkand, the stew includes saffron and tender lamb. He describes it so vividly, you almost resent the bowl in front of you. Entertainment emerges after supper. A musician strums a rabab, the strings humming softly, while a storyteller launches into a tale about Alexander the Great marching through deserts just like this one. His voice rises and falls, hypnotic, though you notice he glosses over the less glamorous details, like Alexander's army constantly running out of water. You chuckle quietly, realizing history is always tidied up at story hour. In the corner, traders compare goods. A man unfurls silk, its threads catching the firelight like captured sunlight. Another presents glassware from distant Rome, each piece delicate enough to make you sweat with anxiety just looking at it. Coins, gems, spices, they're all passed around, weighed, admired. Deals are struck with nods, handshakes, and muttered promises. You find yourself drifting toward the animal pens. The camels, relieved of their burdens, stretch lazily, occasionally groaning like retirees settling into recliners. They smell terrible, but they look content, swaying gently as though humming their own lullabies. One particularly smug camel seems to wink at you. Maybe you imagined it. The caravanserai is more than rest. It's a networking event disguised as survival. Languages mingle, accents crash into one another, and somehow communication flows. You overhear Persian, Turkic, Sanskrit, and a smattering of Greek. Someone even claims to know a little Latin, though he mostly uses it to order more bread. As the night deepens, the stars reveal themselves, so sharp and plentiful they make modern city skies look like dim photocopies. You lie on your mat, listening to the rustle of fabric, the faint notes of a fading song, and the rhythmic chewing of camels still working through their dinner. It is, in its own way, a kind of paradise. Dusty, crowded, noisy paradise, but paradise nonetheless. Tomorrow the road calls again, but tonight you rest in the echo of countless travelers who stopped in this very courtyard, all sharing the same relief. Finally, a wall between themselves and the endless desert. Morning at the caravanserai arrives not with a gentle alarm clock, but with the unmistakable chorus of camels groaning, merchants shouting, and pots clanging as breakfast is stirred. You sit up slowly, joints stiff, hair full of dessert grit, and wonder if anyone in history has ever woken refreshed in a caravanserai. Probably not. But as you shuffle toward the courtyard, the smell of baking flatbread lifts your mood. it seems survival always tastes better when wrapped in carbs. Breakfast on the silk routes is not a lavish spread. You tear at bread that feels somewhere between cracker and sandal sole, dipping it into bowls of warm lentil mash. Someone sprinkles dried herbs across the top, and suddenly it tastes almost sophisticated. A jug of goat's milk is passed around again, and you do your best not to make the same grimacing face you made yesterday. This time, you manage a dignified sip, though your stomach clearly files a complaint with your brain. Historians still argue whether caravanserai kitchens were standardized or whether each cook improvised with whatever supplies were on hand. Some archaeological remains show traces of imported spices, pepper, cinnamon, saffron, suggesting menus may have been more varied than the dusty lentils in your bowl. Still, this morning, your palate is stuck firmly in the functional fuel category. Once fed, you join the group gathering outside. The lead driver barks instructions, and everyone moves like clockwork. Camels kneel, loads are retied, ropes are tugged, and shouts bounce off the stone walls. It's a chaotic symphony, half organized, half bedlam, but somehow it works. You tug on your pack and notice the straps now smell permanently of sweat and camel leather, an aroma you're fairly sure no perfume can mask. The road stretches out again, endless and patient. The first few steps are always the hardest, your body reluctant to surrender comfort for dust. But soon the rhythm returns. Step, sway, crunch, sigh. You glance back once at the caravanserai, its walls shrinking into the distance. For a moment, you imagine the stories embedded in its stones. Thousands of travelers like you, each leaving crumbs, whispers, and laughter behind. Then it's gone, swallowed by the horizon. As the day wears on, the caravan settles into its familiar march. The desert changes subtly in the morning light. Shadows stretch long and thin, and the dunes resemble frozen waves. The wind tugs at your clothes, slipping grains of sand into your shoes. You stop to shake them out, only for the sand to magically reappear minutes later. Perhaps the silk routes are actually run by sand, and everyone else is just a guest. The rhythm of the caravan becomes hypnotic. Hooves strike the earth in patterns, bells clink gently from camels' necks, and voices murmur in a dozen languages. You find yourself almost lulled into a trance, carried forward by momentum rather than will. This, you realize, is the secret engine of the silk routes. Not speed or glamour, but persistence. Along the way, you notice small shrines by the roadside, simple piles of stones marked with cloth scraps fluttering in the wind. Travelers stop briefly, muttering prayers for safe passage. One man ties a knot in his scarf and tucks it among the stones, hoping the gesture will ward off desert spirits. Another presses a coin into the pile, a donation to whichever god happens to be listening. You add a pebble yourself, just in case. After all, you've seen what the desert can do to unprepared travelers. It never hurts to hedge your bets. By mid-morning, conversation picks up again. Someone tells a story about a caravan lost for weeks, surviving only on dates and stubbornness, until they stumbled into a city by accident. Another recounts how a wealthy merchant once filled his entire camel train with nothing but ginger, only to find the market flooded when he arrived. He went bankrupt, but at least he smelled delicious. The camels, oblivious to human chatter, plod steadily. You watch one chew the same mouthful for what feels like an eternity, its jaw swinging like a pendulum. It feels oddly reassuring. No matter how chaotic human plans get, the camel just chews, walks, and spits occasionally for emphasis. As noon creeps closer, the air grows heavy again, and the caravan slows. The sun demands another pause, another shared meal, another reminder that the silk routes are as much about patience as they are about trade. You adjust your scarf, take a deep breath of dry air, and prepare yourself for the long stretch ahead. By midday, the heat beats down like a relentless drum, and the caravan slows to a crawl. Dust lifts in lazy swirls around the hooves of camels, hanging in the air until it feels like you're breathing powdered clay. Every step is an effort, every breath a negotiation. You find yourself longing for shade, though the horizon offers nothing but sand, scrub, and sky. It is here, trudging forward in the monotony, that conversations about protection and guidance naturally begin. The caravan is not only a bundle of traders and animals, it is a moving fortress of shared safety. Out here, danger lurks in forms both obvious and subtle. Bandits are the obvious one. Stories drift among the group of ambushes in narrow passes, of arrows fired from the rocks above, of traders forced to choose between losing their goods or their lives. Mainstream history confirms these risks. Many rulers built watchtowers and stationed soldiers along the routes, charging taxes in exchange for security. Yet merchants still grumbled, much as you might about modern toll roads. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some caravans supposedly hired traveling musicians or holy men, believing their presence deterred ill fortune. Imagine fending off bandits not with swords, but with someone strumming a lute and chanting loudly enough to unsettle the enemy. It may not have been effective in a military sense, but perhaps the noise gave courage, or at least distracted camels from chewing your clothing. Historians still argue whether Silk Route bandits were organized gangs with networks of spies, or simply opportunistic locals desperate for supplies. Records paint both pictures. Well-armed raiders who planned intricate ambushes, and ragged villagers who stumbled across caravans and tried their luck. Either way, traveling in large groups wasn't just practical, it was survival. Beyond human threats, the desert itself was a capricious enemy. Sandstorms could rise without warning, swallowing the world in a wall of grit and wind. You imagine crouching low, pulling cloth across your face, clutching the rope of a camel as visibility vanishes to nothing. Travelers describe these storms as suffocating, disorienting, and loud enough to drown out shouting. The only strategy was to endure, praying the storm would pass before supplies ran too low. Water shortages presented another quiet terror. Wells marked on maps sometimes ran dry, or worse, had been poisoned. Guards often rode ahead to test them, dipping cups cautiously, while others scanned the horizon for mirages shimmering like cruel jokes. You sip carefully from your flask, aware that every drop is accounted for. Yet in the midst of fear, rituals of guidance flourished. The caravan's leader, often an experienced trader or hired guide, played the role of navigator, judge, and therapist rolled into one. His word kept the group moving in unison. When arguments broke out, he settled them with a mix of authority and weary sarcasm, much like a teacher on a school field trip. Prayer was constant. Before setting off each morning, groups muttered blessings in their own tongues. Some burned incense, letting the smoke curl toward the sky as if bribing invisible guardians. Others drew symbols in the sand, protective marks meant to confuse wandering spirits. You find yourself mimicking these small acts, partly for reassurance, partly because everyone else is doing it and you don't want to tempt fate. Superstitions abound. Travelers warn against whistling after sunset, claiming it calls jackals or worse. One man insists that carrying a sprig of wormwood keeps snakes at bay, and he flashes his bundle proudly. Another refuses to wear blue cloth, saying it offends desert spirits. You tuck these bits of folklore into your memory, not entirely convinced, but also not entirely dismissive. After all, you've already seen how stubborn sand can be. It wouldn't surprise you if it held grudges too. Camels, for their part, are their own guardians. Their keen sense of smell sometimes alerts the group to water long before any human notices. A camel might pull stubbornly in one direction, ignoring whips, until finally someone realizes it has led them to a hidden spring. The animals become silent navigators, uncelebrated but vital. You watch yours with newfound respect, even if it does spend most of the day burping. The road stretches on, and the stories of danger weave together with the rituals of safety, forming a rhythm that feels oddly soothing. You begin to understand that the silk routes were never about reckless adventure. They were about endurance, cooperation, and the quiet hope that tomorrow you'd arrive safely at another caravanserai. And as you walk, guided by prayers, stars, and camels with suspiciously good instincts, you realize that survival here is less about strength and more about trust. The sun finally begins to sink, and the promise of shade pulls the caravan toward the next resting point. When the gates of another caravanserai creak open, you're not only relieved, but also oddly curious. What sort of characters will you meet tonight? If yesterday's stop was a dusty blend of stew and storytelling, tonight feels more like a traveling bazaar squeezed into 4 stone walls. Inside the courtyard, the air hums with chatter. Merchants who arrived earlier are already hawking their wares to anyone with a coin or curiosity. You drift among them, letting your eyes adjust to the flicker of oil lamps, and realize you've stumbled into the Silk Routes version of window shopping. Except, there are no windows, and the shopkeepers are aggressively persuasive. One trader spreads out bolts of silk dyed in colors that shimmer like trapped sunsets. You run your fingers across the fabric, marveling at how impossibly smooth it feels compared to the sandpaper texture of your cloak. He grins knowingly, naming a price so outrageous you nearly choke on your own breath. Negotiation begins, a dance of raised eyebrows, exaggerated sighs, and muttered counters. Mainstream history confirms that bargaining wasn't just custom, it was expected. To accept the first price would mark you as hopelessly naive. A quirky tidbit emerges in these haggling rituals. Some merchants deliberately started with prices 10 times higher, treating the eventual discount as theater. Both buyer and seller knew the numbers were absurd, but the performance gave each side the satisfaction of winning. You play along, pretending outrage, before settling on a number that still feels like daylight robbery. At least you walked away with a scrap of cloth bright enough to double as a warning flag should you ever get lost. Historians still argue whether caravanserai trade was officially regulated or more of a free-for-all. Some evidence suggests guards recorded transactions and collected small taxes, while other sources imply that business was largely informal, relying on reputation to keep deals honest. You suspect the truth lies somewhere between, a system where paperwork existed but was happily ignored when inconvenient. The goods on offer are dizzying. A man from India displays peppercorns in a small pouch, their sharp aroma cutting through the stew-scented air. Another lays out turquoise stones, each polished until they glow faintly in the lamplight. From a corner, you hear the clink of metal as a blacksmith reveals daggers with hilts wrapped in leather, their blades gleaming with unnerving sharpness. Coins clatter, spices are pinched and tasted, and fabrics are rubbed against cheeks. You notice a small group trading stories as much as items, swapping news of distant cities, rumors of new rulers, and even gossip about which caravanserai cook makes the best stew. Information, it seems, is a currency of its own. And then there are the entertainers. A man with nimble fingers juggles clay cups to the delight of children darting between the adults. A singer croons verses in a language you don't recognize, her voice weaving into the smoky night air. For a moment, the caravanserai feels less like a fortress and more like a festival. You try your hand at bartering again, this time for a pouch of dried figs. The seller, a wiry man with mischievous eyes, insists they are the sweetest in all of Persia. You counter, suggesting they look more like shriveled thumbs. He laughs heartily, dropping the price, and you leave with the figs and a strange sense of camaraderie. Perhaps haggling is just another way of making friends. Not all exchanges are about goods. Some merchants trade favors, offering safe escort, sharing maps, or promising introductions in distant towns. You overhear a man arranging to join a caravan heading toward Bukhara, his payment not in coins, but in medical herbs. The web of obligations stretches invisibly, linking people across continents. As the night deepens, the activity softens. Traders pack away their goods, counting coins by lantern light. Deals struck are sealed with handshakes, nods, and the occasional hearty slap on the back. The courtyard quiets into murmurs, the smell of spiced stew once again drifting as the final bowls are ladled out. You settle down, pouch of figs by your side, and realize the marketplace is more than commerce. It's reassurance. The chance to buy, sell, argue, and laugh reminds you that civilization still exists, even in the middle of nowhere. You chew a fig, its sweetness sticking to your teeth, and smile at the absurdity of it all. The desert may be vast and unforgiving, but inside these walls, humanity hums along with all its quirks and bargains. Sleep doesn't last long in a caravanserai. Before dawn, someone stirs the embers of the courtyard fire, and the crackle of wood snaps you awake. You blink into the dim light, rubbing grit from your eyes, and realize others are already bustling, rolling mats, tightening belts, and feeding camels that look almost insulted at being roused this early. The air is crisp, carrying a bite of coolness that will vanish the moment the sun climbs. This is the hour of departure. Lanterns still flicker faintly, casting long shadows as loads are hoisted onto kneeling camels. You catch the sour smell of sweat mixed with the earthy musk of animals and leather. Voices murmur instructions. Ropes creak as they're pulled taut. Everyone moves with a kind of groggy efficiency, eager to get as many miles as possible before the desert heat starts its daily punishment. Mainstream history tells us caravans often began their march before sunrise, precisely to avoid that punishing heat. Yet here's a quirky tidbit. Some groups believed setting out in total darkness invited misfortune, so they waited until the very first hint of dawn. The result was a compromise. Travel early, but not so early that spirits of the night might linger on the road. Historians still argue whether these dawn rituals were rooted in religion or simple practicality. Was it faith that made people hesitate, or the pragmatic knowledge that stumbling around in pitch black with camels and cargo was a recipe for disaster? Either way, the habit of first light departures became a rhythm across the routes. As the caravan lumbers out through the gates, you notice each person clutching something: amulets, prayer beads, even small charms sewn into clothing. One man fingers a turquoise stone as he mutters verses under his breath. Another sprinkles a pinch of salt into the sand, whispering a blessing before stepping forward. You copy the gesture, scattering crumbs from last night's bread, partly respectful, partly hedging your bets. The camels take to the road with their usual groaning disapproval, but soon their strides even out, bells chiming gently with each sway. The morning air is kind, cool enough to lift your spirits. Your feet crunch against packed earth, and for a while the march feels almost pleasant, as if the desert is indulging you. It's in this early hour that routines shine. A scout rides ahead, scanning the horizon for landmarks or signs of trouble. Guards trail the edges, their eyes sweeping the dunes, hands resting on spears. The caravan leader rides near the front, glancing back often to make sure the line doesn't fray. You realize this isn't just travel, it's choreography. Everyone has a role, and the road demands they play it well. Breakfast happens on the move. You nibble on a date pulled from your pouch, sticky sweetness breaking the monotony of dust. Others chew almonds or sip cautiously from water skins. The sound of quiet chewing mingles with the steady thump of hooves, creating a strange symphony of survival. As the sun rises, painting the dunes in pale gold, the caravan begins its daily rhythm of conversation. Some recount dreams they had in the caravanserai, visions of endless feasts, strange omens, or simply longing for home. Others discuss markets ahead, calculating profits with hopeful eyes. A few walk in silence, heads bowed, lips moving in whispered prayers. The desert slowly reveals itself in the morning light. You notice tiny tracks etched into the sand, beetles, lizards, and perhaps something larger slinking away before dawn. A falcon circles overhead, scanning for prey. The world feels alive in subtle ways, reminding you that even here, life persists stubbornly. There's humor, too. A merchant jokes that camels are the only animals who look more exhausted in the morning than at night. Another quips that his sandal straps are holding on by pure faith. Laughter drifts across the caravan, gentle and fleeting, but enough to lighten the weight of the march. The day stretches before you, long and uncertain, but for now, the cool air and rising sun give a sense of possibility. You take another bite of your date, adjust your scarf, and step forward with the rest, caught in the rhythm of ancient travelers who began each day the same way. Half awake, half hopeful, wholly dependent on one another. The hours after sunrise stretch long and steady, each step blending into the next, until time itself feels like sand slipping through your fingers. The road stretches ahead, unbroken, and the monotony begins to tug at your thoughts. Walking in a caravan isn't glamorous. It's repetition, dust, and the hum of hooves. But it's within that monotony that daily routines take root, those small, almost invisible acts that keep everyone moving forward. You fall into rhythm with the group. Each traveler has their own peculiar habits. The merchant beside you clears his throat every few minutes, as if auditioning for a camel choir. A young boy whistles tunelessly, earning occasional glares but never stopping. A woman counts her steps softly under her breath, 1 to 10, then starting again, like a walking meditation. And then there's you, cataloging every ache in your body while pretending your joints aren't staging a rebellion. Mainstream history often paints the silk routes as exotic highways buzzing with luxury goods, but the reality was far plainer. Most of the day was spent trudging, sweating, and waiting for the next chance to sit down. A quirky tidbit, though. Some caravans developed traveling songs, slow chants that match the pace of footsteps and camel strides. These weren't exactly cheerful tunes, more like long, droning refrains that sounded like lullabies for people who were too tired to care. But they worked. Singing helped keep the line together, warded off boredom, and reminded everyone that time was, in fact, still passing. You hum along when the group begins a chant, surprised to find yourself soothed by its repetitive melody. Historians still argue whether these chants were practical tools for coordination or spiritual invocations disguised as music. Some think they kept caravans marching in rhythm, reducing chaos. Others suggest they summoned protection, offering prayers hidden in song. Perhaps they were both. The day also brings rituals of maintenance. Every so often, the caravan halts briefly, so travelers can check straps, retie loads, or rub sore feet. Someone always has to fix a sandal, replacing frayed leather with scraps of rope. You notice one man carrying an entire spare pair of sandals dangling from his pack like trophies. Clearly the voice of experience. Conversations bubble up and fade. Two men argue about whether Bactrian camels are superior to dromedaries. Another recounts the story of a market where salt was once traded ounce for ounce against gold. You half listen, letting the chatter wash over you. It's like white noise, human voices filling the silence so the desert doesn't swallow your thoughts. The monotony has its own challenges. Your mind wanders in strange directions. You imagine what it would be like if modern commuters had to trudge through deserts with camels instead of sitting in traffic jams. Perhaps not so different. Everyone's still tired, everyone's still complaining. The animals mirror the mood. Camels march steadily, their pace unchanging, their expressions fixed in eternal disdain. Occasionally one snorts or flicks its tail, as if mocking human fatigue. Donkeys lag behind, needing constant encouragement, while dogs trot happily at the edges, sniffing at nothing in particular. By midday, the sun reasserts itself, pressing down on your shoulders like a heavy blanket. Scarves tighten, heads bow, and the caravan slows. The leader calls for a brief rest under the meager shade of a rock outcrop. People sink onto the ground with sighs that could rival poetry. Lunch is predictable: bread, nuts, maybe a piece of dried fruit if you're lucky. Yet even this small pause feels luxurious. Someone pours out weak tea, brewed in a battered pot, and the warm bitterness is oddly comforting. You sip slowly, watching steam rise in delicate curls that look impossibly out of place against the harsh desert. When the group rises again, groaning, the road seems endless, but routine kicks in. Step after step, sigh after sigh, you carry forward, the monotony itself becoming the rhythm of survival. You realize this is the heart of the Silk Routes. Not the glamorous markets at the end, but the persistence of ordinary days, where repetition becomes the glue that holds the journey together. The sun dips lower, and with it, the pace of the caravan softens. Evening is approaching, and everyone begins to think less about trade or survival, and more about the comfort of food. Tonight, the air carries a faint promise of spice, the kind of scent that seems impossible out here in the barren landscape. Yet it clings to the memory of bustling markets far away. When the caravan halts, fires are kindled with surprising speed. Dried dung, brushwood, or even old twigs saved from earlier stops serve as fuel. You sit near one fire, your eyes tracing the delicate spiral of smoke as it lifts into the fading light. Around you, people begin pulling out sacks, jars, and bundles tied in cloth. What appears at first to be a random assortment quickly transforms into dinner. The mainstream historical fact is that food along the Silk routes was as varied as the people who walked it. One night you might eat Central Asian flatbread baked on hot stones, and the next you might be sampling a stew flavored with Persian herbs. Spices traveled just as freely as silk, and though meals were often simple, they carried the aromas of far-flung lands. A quirky tidbit: some travelers believed garlic was a charm against illness and evil spirits. Entire cloves were tucked into pockets or eaten raw before sleep, to the dismay of anyone nearby. You catch the sharp tang of garlic in the air tonight, and can't help but imagine your entire row of sleepers marinated like a side dish. There is also debate. Historians still argue whether caravans pooled their food communally or guarded their supplies jealously. Some evidence suggests a shared pot, everyone tossing in what they had, so the stew became a mix of flavors and goodwill. Others claim merchants were far too protective of their precious sacks of rice or dried apricots. You look at your portion and wonder whether the spices drifting from the next fire are born of generosity or just very strong winds. As the stew simmers, bread is slapped against the inside of portable clay ovens carried by certain cooks, each piece sticking until browned. The smell is irresistible, earthy and nutty, the kind of scent that makes you forget the blisters on your feet. Someone slices dried dates into the pot, and the stew takes on a sweetness that surprises you. Dinner is served in chipped bowls or shared directly from ladles, with people dipping bread to soak up the broth. Around the fires, conversations relax. Stories flow more easily on a full stomach. A veteran traveler tells of a market in Samarkand where melons were said to be so large that one could feed a family for days. Another insists he once tasted a fermented horse milk drink that made him sing songs in languages he didn't know. You laugh along, even though your mouth is still full of bread that feels like it could crack a tooth. The animals, too, are fed. Camels munch on thorny plants, somehow immune to the spines that would shred your lips. Donkeys get their share of grain, and dogs circle greedily, hoping for scraps. You notice how feeding the animals first is an unspoken rule. Without them, no person would eat tomorrow. The firelight softens everyone's features, and the day's sharp edges blur. Faces that looked tired and irritable under the sun now glow with warmth, framed by flickering shadows. Laughter comes easier, and even the merchants who spent the day grumbling over sandal straps now share figs with their neighbors. You lean back, belly warm, watching sparks dance upward into the indigo sky. The desert is no longer empty. It hums with the quiet domesticity of a traveling village. Food here is more than sustenance. It is the one daily event that feels like celebration, a reminder that even on a road of endless dust, flavors from distant lands can still meet in one pot. Tomorrow, the monotony will return, but tonight, you savor the simple magic of stew shared under the stars. Night deepens, and the fires slowly fade into glowing embers. The caravan begins the ritual of settling in, that long exhale after a day's march. You spread a mat on the packed earth, or perhaps just a blanket if you have one, and try to convince your tired body that rocks are pillows and sand is comfort. The truth is, it's not the most restful sleep, but you take what you can get. The mainstream historical fact: caravans rarely camped without some form of organization. Travelers arranged themselves in loose circles or long rows, often placing animals on the perimeter to act as an early warning system. Camels, with their keen senses and tendency to grunt at any disturbance, doubled as night guards. Some leaders even positioned fires strategically, so the flickering light created a sense of safety against prowling animals or opportunistic thieves. Still, safety was never guaranteed. Bandits were a constant concern, and so night watches were assigned. You imagine drawing the short straw, standing half awake with a spear in hand, listening to the sound of wind across the dunes, wondering if every shadow is real. You're quietly relieved when your role is simply to lie down and pretend the ground is comfortable. A quirky tidbit: some caravans carried charm bundles, small pouches filled with herbs, bones, or bits of colored thread, believed to keep evil spirits away while people slept. You notice one hanging from a traveler's belt as he tucks into his blanket, muttering a short prayer before rolling onto his side. Historians still argue whether these charms were genuine expressions of faith or simply cultural insurance policies, a way of saying, well, it can't hurt. Either way, the act of hanging a talisman or chanting a prayer undoubtedly made sleep easier in such exposed conditions. The soundscape of night is its own kind of lullaby. Camels sigh and chew cud, donkeys snort, and somewhere a dog barks at nothing visible. The wind carries grains of sand across your face, whispering like a restless spirit. You pull your cloak tighter, half expecting a scorpion to wander by, and decide not to think too hard about that possibility. Sleep doesn't come quickly. Your mind replays the day's march, the endless steps, the songs, the stew. You shift from one hip to the other, trying to avoid that one sharp rock that seems personally determined to ruin your rest. And yet, exhaustion has its way. Slowly, your muscles unwind, and your breath finds the rhythm of the caravan around you. Occasionally, a shout breaks the night as someone on watch spots movement. A fox slipping by, or maybe just a camel trying to sneak an extra bite of thorn bush. Each time, you stir, then sink back into drowsiness, reassured that someone else is keeping guard. Above, the stars blaze. The desert sky is impossibly clear, as if the heavens are flaunting every constellation at once. You trace the familiar ones, then lose yourself in the unfamiliar. For a moment, you feel both very small and strangely important, part of a long chain of travelers who looked up at this same sky, centuries before you. Eventually, weariness triumphs. The noises blur, the wind softens, and your last conscious thought is how, even in such uncomfortable circumstances, sleep finds you like an old friend who doesn't care if the bed is made. Morning edges into the camp slowly, not with trumpets or grand announcements, but with the subtle gray light that turns shapes into shadows and shadows into camels. You stir from uneasy dreams, blinking away grains of sand that somehow worked their way into your eyelashes. The ground beneath you feels both softer than you remember and harder than you'd like. Proof that even when you sleep, the desert never truly lets you forget it's there. The mainstream historical fact is that caravan mornings were never leisurely affairs. Travelers rose before sunrise, often while the stars still lingered, to take advantage of the cooler hours. Fires were coaxed back to life for one last bit of warmth, and breakfast was quick. Flatbread, perhaps a handful of nuts, maybe a sip of leftover tea. This was no time for feasts. The road demanded an early start. A quirky tidbit: In some regions, it was common to rub the eyelids with coal before heading out, not just for beauty, but as a supposed protection against the glare of the sun. You catch a few fellow travelers carefully applying dark lines around their eyes, looking halfway between glamorous and perpetually unimpressed. Historians still argue whether such cosmetic rituals were widespread among caravans or mostly confined to certain cultures. Were they practical, reducing glare and warding off infection, or simply a matter of style that persisted despite the hardships of travel? Either way, the sight of men and women carefully tracing their eyelids at dawn makes the camp look like a backstage dressing room for a play no one rehearsed. You gather your few belongings, brush the dust from your clothes, knowing it will return within minutes, and help dismantle the temporary camp. Blankets are rolled, tents collapsed, packs hoisted. The camels are loaded once more, grumbling as if offended that anyone thought they'd signed up for labor. A donkey refuses to budge until bribed with a scrap of bread, proving that stubbornness is a universal constant. There's a peculiar silence in these early moments. People move with a kind of half-conscious efficiency, still half asleep, yet already resigned to the long march ahead. Conversations are few, words conserved like water. Instead, you hear the creak of leather straps, the shuffle of sandals, the low complaints of animals, and the faint sigh of the wind. The road awaits again, endless, dusty, indifferent to your progress. But there's a strange comfort in the repetition. Yesterday you walked it. Today you will walk it again. Tomorrow will be the same. The silk routes were not about rushing, but about enduring, about pressing forward step by dusty step, until markets appeared on the horizon like mirages that finally proved real. As the caravan stretches into its line once more, you fall into place. The chant begins again, slow and steady, pulling you into rhythm. The rising sun turns the sand into gold, though it feels less like treasure and more like a challenge. Still, you move, one foot in front of the other, because that's what this road has always demanded. And so, with a belly still remembering last night's stew, a body only half rested, and a spirit oddly soothed by the predictability of it all, you walk on. The silk routes unfold ahead, as they have for centuries, long, dusty, and strangely comforting.